We're going to get started shortly. If you would take a seat at one of the tables, that would be great. We'll start in 1 minute. Grab some pizza, get a drink, have a seat.
Say hi because I never even heard that.
Hey.
I don't know if you remember the Meetup analytics by design.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Good stuff.
So things are going well.
Yeah.
Excited.
All right. There's going to be time for networking later. Wrap up the conversations for now, take a seat, and we'll get going. All right, welcome to the September 2019 edition of Agile TO Meetup. Great to have everybody out. Seems like a pretty good turnout this time. We got some great stuff for you. I guess first off, though, want to thank Wrangle, as always, for being our premium sponsor. You have Wrangle to thank not just for this venue, but for the pizza and beverages as well. So always great to have their support. And with that, I'm going to turn it over for a couple of minutes to Myron to say a few words.
Hello, thanks for coming out today. We love pizza as well, so glad that you're enjoying the networking time. I just wanted to basically give you a few words about the Wrangle and the journey that we're on. So please bear with me, a lot of it's written down. And then I'll just, afterward, just hand it back over to Tom and get you going. So Wrangle is a digital transformation consultancy that solves the compelling digital challenges facing small and large companies today. Thank you. Our skilled experts are obsessed with turning great ideas into reality and getting them to market fast. We partner with companies like Staples, Google, Uniqlo, RBC, Pacific Life, to solve challenges through strategy, design, and development. This means that Wrangle isn't just a groundbreaking team of industry leaders. We are your partners in innovation, and through our partnerships, Wrangle accelerates digital innovation to create exceptional products and experiences. You might know that Wrangle's been here for over 5 years, and we're really excited about being a part of and supporting this Agile community. So time and again, we really appreciate when you come out and really show interest in the types of things that are happening to drive innovation forward in the lean Agile space. And so one of the things that we ask is if you get a chance, tweet us out on Twitter and use the Learn with Wrangle hashtag at Wrangle.io. Just give us a sense of, or give the community a sense of what's something you learned today, what's something you shared today, and just overall give a sense of the community of what the experience is when you come to Wrangle and when you participate in events such as this one. So I want to thank you again for coming out, and I really appreciate your time. And now I'll just hand it over to Tom so we can get going.
Thanks again, Myron. We really struggle without you those times when we're hosted somewhere else. You guys do such a great job here. All right, so next up, just a few announcements. Always want to encourage you. We've got a lot of the earlier meetups posted online, so if you want to go back and look at any either that you attended and want to see again, or you didn't attend and want to see for the first time. Twitter, Myron mentioned tagging Wrangle. I'd also encourage you to hashtag AgileTO, and we have our own Twitter account as well that you can follow and get the latest on this community. A few things coming up. We're collaborating with the Analytics by Design team on an event on October 3rd. They have a focus on project management, but they see Agile as very much the future of that discipline and have asked us to collaborate with them in that context. I'll be posting a link to their Eventbrite site and the information about that event over the next couple of days. So that should come to you if you're subscribed to the Agile TO meetup group. Agile Drinks is coming up. The date is still to be determined. Once again, you'll get a notification about that. That'll get posted on our meetup site pretty soon. I don't see Michael here, so he may have a better idea about that. Second week of October. Okay, great. Play for Agile is coming up later this month, quite soon. There are, I believe, still tickets available if anybody's interested in that. A great event. A lot of the people here will have attended prior editions, myself included. So if you're curious about that, I can give you the lowdown if you're interested in taking some time for an unconference to learn about how to apply adult play to the agile practice. New meetup in town. So Trish, I don't know anything about this. I guess there's a date for the kickoff, but I guess it's pretty self-explanatory, a product owner clinic, similar, I guess, from the other side of the house to the Scrum Master clinic that already exists. With that, can I invite, I know there are a couple of people at least that had additional announcements. Jillian, did you want to say a couple words?
Hey everyone, I'm Jillian. I'm an Agile coach and I work at a supply chain software company called Nulogy that's down the street. Yeah, actually Dan's from Nulogy. And, and I'm recruiting an Agile coach. And I would love to talk to anyone here who is an Agile coach and has pretty good facilitation skills and some experience with experiment-driven product innovation, as well as the Kanban method. So if you'd like to chat with me, I'll be around. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Jillian. Jillian's great to work with, so highly recommend checking that out if you're in the market. Paul.
Hello, everyone. My name is Paul. I'm from Agile Book Exchange. In the far corner, you'll see a table set up with a bunch of books. The way it works is it's a service I'm bringing to the community where all the books on the table, louder? Oh. All the books on the table, whoa, are $10 each. If you like the book, take it home, $10, it's yours. If you don't like it, within 30 days, return it to me and I give you back half your money. So this is a service, like I said, bring to the community. I also have a website, agilebookexchange.com. So if you want, swing on by and say hi. Thanks.
Any other announcements, events in the community?
Hi folks, my name is Alex. I actually used to work here a few years ago. Great place to work. So I'm a Scrum at Scale trainer. So Scrum at Scale is a framework created by Jeff Sutherland. And I actually have a course coming up here in this very space in 2 weeks on Saturday and Sunday, so September 28th, 29th. And if anyone wants to learn how to scale their organization, scale agility, please come and talk to me.
Great. Any, double duty.
That's true. I've got the headset.
Oh, right.
So, hi everyone. I know I'll be speaking here in a minute. I'm Carlos, by the way. But just as part of the community updates, so we're doing actually a training session in November on design sprints and testing ideas. So there's some flyers there if you're curious about it and you want to ask questions after the talk. Happy to talk more about it. So, thanks.
Great. Any other announcements? Anything else to share with the community? All right. Well then, without further ado, we'll move on to the main event. Carlos and Julian, come on down. I probably am not going to do as good a job introducing you guys as you can. So I'll hand it off and let you run with it from here.
For sure. Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it. Actually, so I'll just plug in my laptop really quick. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. It's really nice to see so many people available and interested in this talk. So I was kind of unsure to see if anybody would be interested. It's a little bit of a different talk, so it's going to focus more on innovation. But also, how do you integrate it, let's say, with agile teams? So obviously, there's a bit of a theme here. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces as well. So I appreciate getting a chance to reconnect with some friends. So yes, thank you so much for joining me at Experiment-Driven Product Innovation. I am Carlos Oliveira, and Julian, where's Julian? Julian's my assistant. He's a recent graduate of the Masters of Innovation program at the Smith School of Business. So if you have any questions about post-secondary education, in terms of innovation, he's your man, and he's going to be also taking some photographs. Is everybody okay with taking pictures tonight? Yeah? Anyone not want their picture taken? No? Sorry to put you on the spot like that. Yes. Yes. Sounds good. Is that better? Yeah? Awesome. Awesome. All right, so let's get started. So just a really quick introduction in terms of my background. So I've been working with product teams and agile teams, I guess since 2008, in a different capacity at that moment. So I used to have a company. We developed learning management systems, enterprise learning management systems. We had lots of different clients here in the Toronto area and really focused on product management. So building really great e-learning experiences, allowing big companies to kind of help push training to their sales force and their service technicians, eventually to all employees to do compliance-based training. Pretty exciting, did that for about 10 years. Eventually, that got acquired by OpenText, which is based out of Waterloo. So it was a fun time. They went through a big agile transformation, 5,000 developers and QA and different people, and that was a lot of fun, so doing a lot of training, coaching. Eventually went back to helping startups and incubators and testing ideas. Actually met Peter that way. We used to do lean startup machine workshops in Toronto, which was a lot of fun. So experimentation, validating ideas, and then eventually working with teams again within kind of enterprise environments. And that's what I've been doing for the most part for the last, I guess, since 2014, essentially. So now I work with adaptiveX as a principal advisor and really helping kind of introduce repeatable processes for testing ideas and innovation inside of organizations. And also providing training as well, so empowering employees, running training, workshops, things of that nature. So lots of different stuff, and happy to share more after the talk if anyone is interested. So why are you here? What's the purpose of this workshop? What are we actually going to be diving into? So one thing to consider is, what do we mean when we're talking about product innovation or innovation in general? How is it helpful? So what's this kind of word of lean experimentation? Now, some of you might already be experts in this or be exposed to it in other different ways. So happy to contribute to the dialogue for sure. How do we actually implement the mindset, the principles, but maybe some of these techniques on agile teams as well? And then lastly, what are some of those principles? So when I say principles and mindset, what are they? What are some things that we should actually be considering? Hopefully, if things go well, you'll be able to take one or two things back to your organization, whether you're working with teams or you're working in governance, for example, or management. What are some things that you can actually take back and implement at your company? Okay, so because we are going to be running a workshop, just a couple of really quick working agreements. So one, I'm going to be using time boxing. We're all familiar with time boxing. I'm going to be using the hands up protocol, which means, if you see my arm go up, then finish your sentence and raise your hand as well. If you see anybody's hand go up, same idea, finish your sentence and then raise your hand as well. Ideally, no devices. It looks like all the eyeballs are on me right now, so I'm not too worried about devices right now. So that's a good sign. That doesn't happen too often. And then in terms of questions, so we've obviously allowed for some time at the end of the workshop where we can ask questions, have a dialogue. Obviously, throughout the presentation, like the first 15 minutes or so, there's going to be a mini talk, and I'm going to be asking you questions, and I'll make sure that other people can hear you by repeating what you say. And then we're going to try something out for about 20 or 30 minutes, and then we're going to have a break, a 15-minute break. So there is a break in between the talk for 15 minutes. And then in the second half, we're actually going to design an experiment. So when we come back from the break, we'll design the experiment. We'll talk a little bit about that experiment. We'll have a Q&A period, and then I hear there's a really great party afterwards over at Kelly's Landing, is it? Yeah. So maybe we'll connect there as well. Any questions before we get started? So let's just dive into it. Okay, This graph is a little bit older, but the idea here, if everybody can see it, okay, is this is the S&P 500, right? So this is an index, and it's showing the life expectancy of organizations on the S&P 500 since 1960. And so what you can see, so the data's been normalized a little bit, but what you can see is if you were an organization and you were on the S&P 500 back in the 1960s, you would have enjoyed an average life expectancy of over 60 years. These days, you're lucky to get 15. So what's happening? What do you guys think is happening? There's some disruptors. What's being disrupted? Or like, what are you thinking there? What's happening there? Sorry? New entrants into the market, so some competition, yeah. And maybe what's causing that, the new entrants into the market? Like more so, I guess, than before, potentially. The pace of change is accelerating. Technology is changing. Customer satisfaction, right? Customer preferences. I think I'm in between am I in between? I'm in between. Can you guys still hear me or am I cut off? I'm good now? Okay.
But also the economic conditions.
Economic conditions, okay. Is changing as well?
Yeah, I mean, some companies maybe they won't survive.
Right. They won't survive because the actual economics, let's say, or the condition. Yeah, so maybe there's other variables there as well. Olivier? The VUCA challenge, right? So volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, exactly. Regulation, right? Clamping down on certain industries, social media, blockchain, which is kind of maybe tightening. Some companies won't make it. They'll get swallowed up, essentially. Yeah, there's lots of things happening. One thing I kind of want to mention, though, is going back to, I think, this gentleman, I didn't catch your name. Dave? Yeah, thanks, Dave. So you kind of mentioned, like, customer preferences are changing, right? So you kind of have this kind of pull method that's being introduced. So here's kind of an example. You know, on the left-hand side, you've got Heinz, over 100 years, brand-centric, really pushing that bottle. And over the last 10 years, they've iterated on the one on the right-hand side over 15 times. To the point that when you're actually in a grocery store and you're looking at people buying ketchup, for example, they're trying out the different bottles based on that form factor, that usability, and even choosing the one that is more user-friendly, essentially. To the point where Heinz is patenting the designs, essentially, so that their competition can't steal it from them or using it. But business is changing, right? Businesses have picked up on this. They're saying, okay, you know, you walk into a drugstore, for example, there's thousands of different shampoo products, for example. There's so many choices. Consumers have so many different personalization preferences that they're demanding from the market. So design essentially is good for business, right? It's actually becoming a huge competitive advantage. Sometimes you hear it as customer centricity, so really listening to the customer, understanding their needs, understanding what they're looking for, what they want, for example, and then fine-tuning our strategy and fine-tuning our value proposition, essentially what we're delivering to them, based on that. If you look again back at the financial performance of organizations that do focus on this, that really look at design and customer centricity, essentially, here's one example. You take the design index that outperforms just the regular S&P 500 by a considerable difference, essentially. Can everybody hear me okay at this point? Yeah? We're good? All right. I'm going to try and turn my laptop as a comfort monitor to allow me to see all of the slides that I'm working with here. Okay, here's a statistic from Clayton Christensen, right? And he says 95% of products that will hit the market will fail this year, or next year, let's say, which is interesting. It's your classical kind of like fail statistic, essentially. So 300,000 products will hit the shelves, 95% of them won't be there, the same products, let's say, the following year. So kind of digging into this, like what causes some of this failure, innovation failure, right? Epic failure, essentially, where lots of people have kind of put time and money, maybe their careers, essentially, on the line, and things don't work out. One professor that I worked with, actually at the Smith School of Business, who does a lot of work in innovation and lean innovation, He did a lot of research and looked at over 500 organizations and found like some of the common patterns were two things in terms of innovation that was successful and innovation that was not successful, that was failing. The first is not truly really understanding who your customer is, essentially. And sometimes we'll work with teams and we'll say, okay, who is your customer? No, thanks, Trish. Who is your who is your customer, essentially? And the problem is, the common response is, well, it's all of our company's customers, right? So it's all of X brand's customers, essentially. The problem is not all of X brand's customers have the problem that you're actually working on. And even the ones that do have the problem that you're working on, not all of them really care. It's not significant enough that they would actually go out of their way to truly try out your product. And so the whole concept here is it's a lot smaller initially, a group of people that we're really kind of looking at in terms of onboarding, getting them to really kind of understand their needs, essentially. And then the second part is one that we're all familiar with, is the idea that we kind of do this one and done. So we're not iterating or refining the solution based on feedback, based on needs, essentially. So what does this look like a lot of times? One, we have an idea we want to launch, right? We want to get it out there into market. We know that the sooner that we can actually start to collect some data and get some feedback, essentially, from our customers, the better position we'll be in to be able to kind of refine and iterate on that solution. The reality is, in order to do that, a lot of times what we tend to do is we say, okay, let's build something, right? Let's build an MVP, or let's get a first release kind of out to market, essentially. But what tends to happen is the build cycles start to kind of get drawn out, right? So initially we were thinking, okay, we're gonna ship this month, we're gonna put something into production. And then eventually it becomes 2 months, and then eventually it becomes 3 months, or a year, worst case scenario. And so obviously the longer that we're kind of delaying that cycle, the more risk we're actually introducing that we're working on the wrong thing, or we're building the wrong thing, essentially. So this is not what we want to be doing, right? We all know this. We want to do this as quickly as possible. So here's kind of our idea. Let's get the data as quickly as we can, and then move from there. Continue to refine it and build on it from that perspective. In 2017, Ideo did a big study. And what they found was organizations that iterate on 5 or more different solutions are 50% more likely to launch successfully. That's crazy. So that says we're actually not trying enough options or enough ideas, essentially. Right? In a lot of ways, it's kind of like the game Plinko. Anybody ever watch The Price is Right? No? You guys remember The Price is Right? Remember the game Plinko? So somebody would stand on the top of a board, and they'd have a token, essentially, and they would drop the token, and the token would hit and bounce against bumpers and eventually land in a gap for some prize money, right? So if it landed in this slot, for example, they would get no dollars. If it landed in another slot, they would get $100 or $1,000 or $10,000, for example. Now, if you're only providing one token, one option, you've got one chance to win, essentially, right? What we're saying is, provide as many options, as many tokens, especially early on, because those tokens are fairly cheap. They're not necessarily going to cost a lot. You can kind of see which ones are moving in the direction that you want them to move into, essentially, to see if the outcomes are going to be winners. Double down on those ones, kill off the ones that don't look like they're going to be providing the outcomes that you want, essentially. And in a lot of ways, you know, options get a lot more expensive as they're kind of moving down the board. That's when we start creating projects, programs, things get more expensive, for example. So in the beginning, options are cheap. We can kind of expand on them as we go. So this is kind of the concept here to increase the chances of success. In 2012, Eric Ries wrote a book called The Lean Startup. So I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with The Lean Startup. He had already been blogging about a lot of the great work that was being done at Facebook in terms of experimentation. So he had been blogging since about 2007, 2008, and eventually he actually came out with this book, initially geared towards startups. The whole idea there is that startups are dealing with a lot of uncertainty, right? So they have very short runways. Their funding cycle, you know, they may only have 90 days to kind of prove out a sustainable model in some cases. So everything that they're doing should essentially be whether or not this provides some value and creates some sustainable business, essentially. So it's all about learning at the end of the day. So how do we do this? How do we learn as quickly as possible to reduce that uncertainty that comes along with creating a business, essentially? So from Eric's perspective, that startup is a human institution designed to create a new product or service under conditions of extreme uncertainty. So that VUCA statement, right? Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. So if we know that if we're doing this right, then what we're doing essentially is we're reducing that risk. So risk is high at the beginning of our project. Maybe we haven't created a lot of value at this point, and we're trying to reduce that risk as quickly as possible and trying to create that value as quickly as possible. And this is all about learning, essentially. Okay, so learning kind of stems from another aspect, which we're calling, let's say, the scientific method. How many people have taken a high school science class? I guess we all had to, right? Because it was mandatory? Peter's laughing at me. He's like, that's such a silly question. Everybody remembers the scientific method? No? We'll have like a quick 20-second refresher. I'll play a video. Does that sound okay? I'm going to play a video from the original, I guess, professor who started to communicate the scientific method. This video comes from the 1950s, 60s, and so you might not be able to see him very well, but you should be able to hear him. So the key here is to listen very carefully.
Now I'm going to discuss it.
Let's just put it on the main audio. Oh, that's not picking up for some reason. Yeah, it's not coming up on the computer. All right, I guess we won't watch the video. Put the microphone? Yeah, not a bad idea. Was that Dave again? Yeah. Good job, man.
How we would look for a new law. In general, we look for a new law by the phone.
Yeah. It is coming out of the speakers? Yeah, that
I
might be.
think it was his mic, because that's definitely not coming to the speakers there. I gotta turn those up.
Then we don't laugh, that's really true. Then we compute the consequences of the gas.
It will happen, right? There will be problems.
If this law that we get is
All right. This one here?
in general, we look for a new law by the following process. First, we guess it. Then we don't laugh, that's really true. Then we compute the consequences of the guess to see what, if this is right, if this law that we guess is right, we see what it would imply.
Yeah.
And then we compare those computation results to nature.
No, the mic's not.
Experiment or experience. Compare it directly with observation to see if it works.
Let's
Okay, try again.
let's try it again.
Law by the following process. First, we guess it. Then we don't laugh, that's really true. Then we compute the consequences of the guess. To see what, if this is right, if this law that we guessed is right, we see what it would imply. And then we compare those computation results to nature. Or we say compare to experiment or experience. Compare it directly with observation to see if it works. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. In that simple statement is the key to science. It doesn't make a difference how beautiful your guess is. It doesn't make a difference how smart you are, who made the guess, or what his name is. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. That's all there is to it.
Thanks, Tom. We finally got that going. Nice. So who wants to, what's the scientific method? Based on what you heard there, what did you hear? Take a guess, yeah, to have a hypothesis. Evaluate it with data, right? So compare it against an experience or nature or an experiment, essentially. And if it disagrees, it's wrong, right? So what else did he say that had people laughing afterwards? Doesn't matter who said it, how beautiful your guess was, what their name was, for example. So, you know, we have this term in the organization, the HIPPO, highest paid person's opinion, right? So a lot of times we run on gut, on intuition, maybe not on data. Maybe we don't have, you know, in all fairness, maybe we don't have the systems, the capabilities, the understanding, like how to actually operate, let's say, in that way. So we're doing the best we can, essentially, with what we have, right? But at the end of the day, there's got to be a way that we can actually evaluate our guess, saying, look, we're just making a guess. We're gonna see and compare it and see the results. And if it doesn't work, then we're gonna make some adjustments. We're gonna take a look and see what else we can be doing. A couple of key product innovation principles here. So one is just having that ignorance. It's just kind of understanding that, look, we don't know what we don't know, essentially, and starting from that frame of mind, that we want to start kind of asking more questions, right? And being explicit about learning in terms of those questions. What are we actually trying to learn here? And then finally, learning from failure. So understanding that, you know, it's not going to line up with nature. And in fact, there is going to be something that's going to be wrong. But in that thing that's wrong, that's going to give us some assistance and some direction in terms of what we should be doing, essentially. So what does it look like? A couple things. One, you're obviously working with a cross-functional team. You want that diversity. You know, you want different perspectives, people that have an understanding of the desirability of a solution, the feasibility of a solution, the viability of a solution, essentially. You want to be explicit about what's the idea, so what are we actually testing, what do we believe to be true? What are our assumptions that we're making about this? You know, what are those desirability, feasibility, viability assumptions? What's the smallest thing that we can do to actually test and understand if we're right or wrong, right? How are we actually going to generate those learnings? How are we going to collect those learnings? And then ultimately, based on that, what decision are we essentially making? I gave you guys a handout. Happy to send over the electronic materials afterwards as well and share with everybody, and then give you copies essentially of those canvases. But ultimately, you kind of see a breakdown of the 6 steps of experimentation, which is being explicit about your idea, understanding what your riskiest assumptions are, being explicit about what you're going to be learning, essentially, right? So what's that first learning goal that you have? How are you going to find the truth? So again, what's the smallest thing you can do to actually get the truth? How are you going to measure that truth? So is it going to be qualitative, quantitative? And then what decision are you going to be making based on that? So I can keep talking until the cows come home, but let's try some stuff out. So let's actually give it a shot and see where we land, right? So this famous quote by Ash Maurya, in terms of practice trumps theory, essentially. Okay, so everybody is in groups. If you're in a small group, if you have an opportunity, try and find a couple more team members. So try, if you can, to get into at least 3 or 4, if possible. All right, looks like everybody's somewhat settled in terms of your team or your group. So next step, I'm going to need some help. So I need a facilitator at the table. And then just to make the conversations go faster, I also need a decider, right? So a facilitator and a decider. To make this easier, the person whose birthday is next at your group is going to be the facilitator. And the person in the group whose birthday most recently passed is going to be the decider. Okay, so have a quick conversation and figure that out. Thank you. Awesome. All right. I think everybody should, so my facilitators at the table want to make sure that we have at least kind of one rectangular post-it notes, the 3x5s. You probably have a stack there. Just make sure everybody at your table has at least, let's say, 5 or 6 at least kind of sticky notes in front of them. So try and kind of divide up that stack and give out a few sticky notes to everybody. Everybody should have a Sharpie. There's some small voting dots at the table, so as long as everybody's got those supplies. There's also a set of experiment cards and a few blue dots as well. The blue dots are for the decider, just to make life a little bit easier. All right, we're going to keep going. All right, so let's start with our challenge. This is Richard. Richard is a fitness professional who's passionate about helping people live longer and healthier lives. Okay, so Richard has made this his goal to really help people live longer and healthier lives. So he's come up with an idea. And his idea is to help office workers who have got, let's say, bad back, right? So bad backs, back pain, and the back pain is actually related to potentially posture issues. So sitting at a desk too long, for example. And this is a huge market. So, 50 million people just in North America with back problems. And what he's decided to do is come up with this idea. So he's got some new innovation, new product, which is a jacket that you can wear. And any time that the jacket detects that you're, let's say, sitting at a desk poorly, it'll send a signal to your phone that nudges you to correct your posture, essentially. Okay? So the jacket is there to help you essentially improve your posture, which then should reduce your back pain. Any questions about that technology or that innovation at this point, that idea? Good question. No, it actually, it's the phone. So the phone will just kind of like send you a little vibration, an alert. So no shockings. So a couple things that are important to think about is I'm going to run you through some of these steps. Now, we're not going to be able to cover every single step, so some of it I'm going to give you the data, give you the information, and then other parts you're actually going to do on your own, essentially. So first we're going to talk about vision. Every good innovation, every product idea should have a solid vision behind it, and there should be some direction that you generally want to go in. The next thing is kind of understanding, okay, well, what are some of the riskiest assumptions you're making right now about this idea? Because those are going to set us up for learning goals, which then essentially become our experiments. And then finally, how do we make decisions kind of in this environment? If we're experimenting weekly or daily or monthly, for example, what are some things that we should look for? And then we'll talk a little bit about continuous innovation, essentially, after that. So let's start kind of just at the beginning, right? So this is Richard. He's got this idea of this technology, wearable technology, essentially. And so what's the long-term vision? So from, what's the kind of the super optimistic view that if we're successful with this idea, what will happen essentially in the future? So from Richard's perspective, the product is going to be a household name and essentially the most effective way to reduce back pain, right? So that's kind of his intent. If things work out well, 2 years from now, household name reduces back pain for people, essentially. Okay, so essentially what is the idea though? Let's break that down. Who's our customer? What's the problem? What's the idea? So wearable technology for office workers with chronic back pain due to bad posture, essentially. So if we're trying to summarize those 3 elements of our strategy, that's what it is. What's a metric, right? So like any good goal or vision, you want to have the ability to measure to say, are we being successful or not? Without going into metrics too deeply, one thing to think about in terms of products and in terms of value propositions, actually Peter did a great value proposition talk here at AgileTO, I think it was last year, yeah, was it? Which was awesome. But in terms of the value proposition, there's this whole aspect of understanding, well, what's the job to be done? You know, what are people actually hiring your product to do, essentially? And when we're picking a good metric, we want to think about a metric that looks at, okay, what's the job to be done, and how are we helping those people get that job done? And are they doing the job with our product, essentially, right? So are they actually using it? So how do we actually measure whether they're using it? So from Richard's perspective, you know, he's up to speed on this stuff. So he says, okay, well, more than 80% of our user base will actually be using our product 3 or more times per week. So this is what we call an actionable metric. It's not a vanity metric. A vanity metric would be, oh, we got 1 million people subscribe to our product, but nobody uses it, right? This is, no, people are actually using it 3 times per week. And in fact, it's quite a high retention rate in terms of our user base. Awesome, okay, so we've got a vision, we have a metric, we have an idea, essentially. So now we gotta think about, well, what can go wrong, essentially? What are some of the learning goals? What are the assumptions that we're actually making? How can we break our strategy, essentially? So these are all the things that can stop us from achieving our goal, right? This is where we get super pessimistic about the idea, essentially. A lot of times you'll see this kind of framework here, this DVF framework, so desirability, viability, feasibility. You can generally put your assumptions into one of these kind of general buckets, right? So desirability is, does anybody care? Do they like this? Is it usable? Viability is, you know, can we make money? Is it cost effective? Can we scale it essentially at these economic conditions? Feasibility is, can we build it? Do we know how to build it? Do we have the skill set, for example? So all kind of looking at all 3 of those. Now a good agile team holistically will look at that stuff, right? With tech and design, UX and product, for example, across all 3 of those to add to the conversation essentially. But a lot of times we kind of start with desirability, because at the end of the day, if our customers don't really care about it, if they don't like it, we can spend a lot of time making it beautiful and putting it into a P&L calculator and making it shine. But if it's broken at that level where customers don't care about it, chances are a lot of that waste will start to occur, right? But in the beginning right now, we're just trying to figure out, okay, well, what are all the assumptions that we're making about the technology? What are all the assumptions that we're making about the customer? What are all the assumptions we're making about the business model, essentially? So what I want you guys to do, actually, I'll give you a quick example first. Some of you might already know this example. Zappos, they sell shoes online. Eventually, they got bought by Amazon for billions of dollars. Originally, when the creator was first starting out, he would go into malls and go into shoe stores and talk to clerks and simply say, hey, if I can sell these shoes online and if people buy them from me, do you mind if I actually come back and I'll buy the shoe off of you? And the clerks would actually laugh at him, right? They'd say, okay, there's no way, nobody wants to buy shoes online. Yeah, do whatever you want, we don't really care. And so initially he just kind of started with taking some pictures of shoes, using a very simple system online. So think Kijiji, for example, like post it up on Kijiji, see if people are actually interested in buying the shoes. And then he really started to see orders coming in, right? So what he's doing here is he's testing desirability. He's testing demand, essentially, to understand, does anybody really care about this stuff? Eventually, the orders started coming in so quickly and so much that then he had to worry about, okay, let's build out an e-commerce site, a proper fulfillment system, a proper supply chain, for example, partners, all of that stuff. But initially, it was just simply, you know, this is kind of my hypothesis. This is what I believe. Does anybody really care? Okay, so that kind of gives you an example of some assumptions that we're essentially making. So we want to figure out, okay, well, what are these assumptions? We're a team, we're kicking off a project, or maybe there's some scope that's come into our backlog that's creeped in, that's kind of huge, and a lot of uncertainty, essentially. And so let's sit down, let's kind of break out some of the assumptions that we're making. So the first thing to help you guys do this is essentially, I'll give you a couple of minutes, and I want you to write down as many assumptions as possible. Now, this one is a little bit tricky, because what you're going to do is, you're going to think in your mind, okay, so we're assuming that people trust this idea or trust this product, for example. So that's what you might be thinking. We will fail if people don't trust this product. But what I want you to do, and this is hard because you're almost going to be multitasking, right, is I want you to take that thought, like how will we fail, how will we break this idea, and then convert it into a question. So if you're saying we will fail if nobody trusts this product, then think about, okay, convert that into will people trust our product? And what I want you to, the final thing I want you to write down on the sticky note is actually the question. Right? So you're brainstorming we will fail if statements essentially with assumptions, but the ultimate thing I want you to write down is actually a question, essentially. Right? Does that make sense? Individually or as a group? Good question. Thanks, Tom. You're always on the ball on this stuff. So this is what we call a together alone activity. Right? So you're not doing group brainstorming. It's a silent individual activity. I'll give you 2 minutes. Think about how this thing will fail, convert it to a question, and then write that down on the Post-it note. Peter? Facilitator doing this too? Yeah, facilitator can join in, for sure. Try and get at least 2 or 3 questions or assumptions, essentially. So I'll give you 2 minutes for that. Don't mind us, we're just taking some pictures, if that's okay. So you got about a minute. Try and get one more kind of assumption, right? So what are all the ways that this can fail with desirability? Like, do people care? Do they want it? What are all the different ways that it can fail from a technology perspective? Infrastructure, integration, all that fun stuff that we deal with on a daily basis. What are all the different ways that this could fail from a business perspective, right? Are we going to charge enough, charge too much? So what are some different assumptions that we're making that will make or break the project or the idea? And then once you got that statement in your head, convert that into like a, can we or will they, for example? Try and get at least 2 if you can, 2 or 3. And remember, 1 per Post-it note. Yeah, so you might have to rewrite. If you've got a couple, you might have to rewrite it. All right, so 2 minutes is up. So this is where we move on to voting. You're going to select the top 3 questions as a group. But first, what I want you to do is, one person at a time at your table is basically just going to read out their Post-its, okay? It's not to defend it. It's not to explain it. It really is just to simply say, okay, this is what I wrote on it in case people can't read it. So you really should just be taking like 10 seconds, essentially. Read out your Post-it note, and then place it on the table, okay? So I'll give you like 3 minutes to do that, essentially. guys are. So you have about a minute left. If you have any duplicates, if you're done and your team is done, you have any duplicates, just, if it's a duplicate, remove it, essentially. Just keep one.
Just
30 seconds. Ten seconds. Okay, so hopefully everybody had a chance to read out. If not, don't worry about it. Hopefully your writing is legible so people can actually read it. So the next step is that everyone's going to get a chance to vote. So everyone should have the red dots. You're going to take 2 dots essentially, and here's the thing to consider. So you're going to think about, okay, what's the most critical question that we should be answering right now, right? So the one that's most critical, that can really make or break the project, the data or the answer essentially, and that we probably know the least amount of evidence or data for, right? So here's an example. One thing to consider is all of those questions will fall into the bucket of desirability, feasibility, or viability, right? D, V, or F, essentially. You can kind of map them into those areas. So if you're thinking, okay, well, you know what, can we make a jacket that's fashionable? Yes, that's critical. Maybe people won't buy it because it's not fashionable, for example. But is it unknown? Well, we know how to build fashionable jackets. We've got, Apple hires designers, for example, so that's possible. So that's a little bit more known, right? What you're looking for is, if you really need to go and do some work to get that data, essentially, so you got to go talk to people, for example. So the unknowns, that's really critical to the success of the project. Here's a hint. A lot of times at this point, if we're starting with innovation, it's kind of that desirability, right? So is there something here around the customer, for example, that's unknown, that's critical? So I'll give you 1 minute. Just take 2 dots. Take a look at the questions that you think are most critical to answer right now and place your vote there.
those 3, like, we've selected all of them, like the whole pool of them. Like
The whole pool of questions that you have?
we mark all of them, right?
You mark the one question that you think you should focus on first. Yeah. So you've got, let's say, 10 questions. You vote which ones you think are most critical to answer first.
And decider doesn't.
Not the decider at this point, yeah. Just the. Yeah. Yeah. No, you can put 2 votes if you want, like on 2 questions. Like one dot on one question, 1 dot on another question. Yeah. So you got about 25 seconds left. 10 seconds. All right. Okay, so decider. Maybe there's a tiebreaker in terms of these questions. So you're going to get one large blue dot, and you're going to choose what is the most critical question that you need to get the data for or the answer to first. Okay, so take your blue dot and choose the question that you think the team should focus on first. You can pick a different one if you want to go against the, you can disagree with the team if you want, yeah. So you have about 15 seconds left. Ten seconds. Okay, so decider, hopefully you've put down a blue dot on one of the questions. Just pick the one that's got the most votes on it and you should be fine. That's not the case. You might not. So you might have to have a longer discussion, essentially. One thing to consider. So a tip for agile teams here. A lot of times we focus on delivery, right? Like, oh, kind of get caught in what's called the build trap. Which, by the way, there's a great book by Melissa Perry called "Escaping the Build Trap," which a lot of what's in some of the material is influenced by that book. So great read if you haven't had a chance to read it yet. But this idea of like, well, teams, it's empiricism. So we learn through experience and we're trying to learn something. So what is the, what's the sprint learning goal, essentially? Like, what are we actually trying to learn this sprint? So these types of questions here, key questions, sometimes we call them sprint questions, can be powerful in terms of this is the learning goal that we're actually going to achieve this sprint, let's say. So that's something that you can apply. And then the reason that we do this is because life is too short to build something that nobody wants. Right? So this is the classic, this is another Ash Maurya. I don't know why I'm in love with him these days, but famous quote, Ash Maurya. So I'll tell a really quick story, and some of you I know have heard this story already, so please don't try and spoil it for everyone else. And then we'll take a break, a 15-minute break. But anyone here from Vancouver, British Columbia? Peter, of course Peter. Always Peter. Peter's from everywhere. No, I'm not, that's not a bad statement. No.
I took that as a compliment.
Yeah, exactly. Anyone else from Vancouver, British Columbia that originally lived there in the past? Okay, sorry, I gotta keep turning to make sure I'm catching everyone. What's your name? Katerina? Yeah, welcome. So you might know this story, maybe. I originally heard it actually from Barry Cross, who does a lot of innovation. So great story, love Barry, thank you for sharing it with me. Okay, so originally in I think it was like the late 90s, the British Columbia government had a hypothesis. So they believed that people wanted to go from the island to the mainland faster for work. Originally, people, if you worked in Vancouver, let's say you were from the island, the ferry would take about 40 minutes to get to the mainland. So the government thought, okay, we can get them there in 20 minutes. We're going to commission the design, the development, the deployment of a very fast ferry. And so what initially was a project that was supposed to be about $150 million and take about 3 years to implement, ballooned to over 350 million, or over 300 million. And by the third year, by the time they got the second or third boat in the water, they canceled the whole project, scrapped it entirely. So people were very upset. They were irate. And then just to kind of add salt to the wound, what happened was they actually sold the boats to a company based in, I think, Michigan, who then refurbished it. So they sold it for like $25 million for all boats, and because they were trying to recover some costs, essentially. And then the company refurbished them, and resold them to some rich people in Dubai for hundreds of millions of dollars. So the public was very, very upset. And they called a scandal. They wanted an independent inquiry to look into it. And that kind of kicked off a whole storm and series of events. So clearly they weren't following this process that you guys are going through right now. But what do you think happened? Like, what could they have done maybe differently? Like, what do you think caused some of this failure? The hypothesis was wrong, clearly, for sure. But maybe where did they go wrong? What were some of the assumptions? Good question. So why did they, yeah, good question. Why did they cancel? Well, before I give you the answer, and like how they failed and why it failed, what do you think maybe they could have done differently, right?
They had a really long cycle time with testing their idea took 3 years.
Right, well, testing definitely took a long time because they had to design the boats, develop them, then deploy them. So testing was a long time for sure. How did you know? I've got no prizes for you. I've got no prizes for you, I'm sorry. Yeah, a lot of times what people say, well, did they talk to the people, for example? Did they actually talk to their customers? Did the customers want this type of boat, for example? Which is kind of like that desirability, let's say, assumption. The reality is if you talk to people, they would have said, well, actually, we kind of like the existing boats because we can lounge outside. It's kind of nice. It's a good experience, for example. The new boats, were kind of packed, let's say like sardines. We got to go fast, for example, so the design is different. But the desirability isn't necessarily what killed them in this instance. That assumption wasn't the one. In this instance, it's kind of like a feasibility or even maybe viability assumption that actually killed them. So what happened was the wake that was being created off these new fast ferries was destroying people's property along the lake shore, right? Or along the shoreline, sorry. It's an ocean, not a lake. And to the point where it was actually, the wake was so huge that it was bringing kind of like family pets back into the ocean, essentially, like swallowing up dogs and stuff like that. So obviously people were pretty upset, so they actually had to throttle the boats, but the problem is the minute you start slowing the boats down, now they're back to 40 minutes, so it causes a lot of problems. But to your point, the consulting company that did the independent inquiry, one of the recommendations that they had at the end was, hey, didn't you guys know that actually they had a very similar boat in Seattle that you could have rented for a week, or leased for a week, just to kind of prove it out, essentially, before making huge commitments or scaling, essentially. So kudos, good job. We're going to take a break, so be back in 15 minutes and we'll wrap up the talk and the workshop. So if we could start making our way back to our seats and with our teams and our groups so we can wrap up the presentation, that would be wonderful. Please and thank you. And you did have more than 12 minutes, by the way. I said 12 minutes, but you had 15, so. All right, so it sounds like we're good to go. Thank you so much. That was fast. Awesome. I hope you enjoyed your break and you had a chance to connect and talk to people that you haven't talked to in a while. That's what communities are about. You can't hear me? Speak up louder. How's that? Is that better? Talk to my laptop, yeah. Is that better? Awesome. Well, we've got great sound people and team members. No, it's not your fault. It's Windows. It was my laptop for sure. So you've been helpful. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on to experimentation. So this is all about actually testing and designing experiments. So a couple things to keep in mind. One, experimentation actually helps us to capture the maximum amount of learning, like what we need to know, right? So you've got questions in front of you, some of them pretty critical, and you're trying to get the learning as quickly as possible. So that's kind of the aspect of experimentation. A lot of times as teams and organizations, what we do is we kind of jump straight from idea to building, final build, right? So final build, final product, essentially. Not realizing, well, actually there's a lot of different things that we could do. There's options here. We don't necessarily have to jump straight to final build. If you look at maybe an example of pre-sale, right? So a company like Tesla has really pioneered and revolutionized the industry based on this model, using that Kickstarter model. So we're not even going to build a factory, we're not going to build any cars, we're not even going to hire people unless you fill out this form and give us money, right? So essentially, you know, once they hit a certain threshold, then they'll actually start to kind of scale and engage the feasibility and the viability of their idea. So in a lot of ways, you know, they pioneered that model, the Kickstarter model, but there's other things that you could do. So Concierge is another experiment where Concierge is actually a really good one to test feasibility. So this is, hey, instead of automating or fully automating your solution, why don't we manually run it for now with customers to see how it operates, to see how it works on a small scale, get some learnings, maybe there's some technical issues, maybe there's some gaps that we have to improve. Sometimes this experiment is also called Wizard of Oz if customers can't tell whether or not, you know, they believe it's automated, but in behind the scenes, we're kind of, you know, manually pulling some of the strings. Obviously, prototyping, so design sprints, if you're interested in that, are great because in a very short period of time, you build some prototype, you learn really quickly from customers, get their feedback before committing something to high quality, for example. So the idea here is that, you know, different experimentation, you've got an idea, and you basically scale based on evidence, right? So don't go straight to scale, scale based on evidence. There's a couple of trade-offs that you got to consider that you're making. The first trade-off is this kind of element of how fast can I learn, right? So speed is king here because it's discovery, it's learning essentially, versus what's the quality of the data? What's the quality of the truth that I'm actually going to be getting? Obviously, the final product is going to give you maximum amount of learning and truth, Because when you've got it into production and customers are using it, either they like it or they don't, essentially, right? Especially if you're at scale with 1 million customers, essentially. So that gives you really strong evidence, but it also takes you a long time to get there. Whereas talking to customers, sometimes customers will tell you one thing, but then behave in a different way. So let's say the amount of truth that you're getting from them may not necessarily be of the highest quality, but it's something that's fast, right? And this is what we know from like qualitative research, for example. We're looking for patterns here, and we're making sure that our questions are structured in a way that allows us to get really good data, essentially. So there's tons of different experiments that you could run. The key thing about experimentation is that it's additive, right? So you kind of want to start small, get some learnings, look at those patterns, and then you start to kind of build on top of that, essentially, right? So you're looking for good enough data that you can start to make some decisions off of, and looking for patterns, and then continue to build off of that. There's a great book actually coming out right now by David Bland, who's writing a book called Testing Business Ideas. It's going to be coming out either this month or next month. And then he's actually going to be coming in January to run a workshop as well. So a deeper workshop. He's got 44 different experiment types that he'll walk you through, essentially. Okay, so as a team, this is where you're going to get a chance to select, okay, how are we actually going to get the data to answer the question that we have, the most critical assumption that we have on the table here. So this is where I'm going to ask my facilitator to help. What I want you to do is there's experiment cards on the table. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes. I want you to just read out the experiments to your team. So same idea here. You don't have to get into a long dialogue. You're just basically reading what's on the experiment card so that the team members understand the general idea behind the experiment, essentially. Okay? So you can spread out the cards on the table, read them out loud to your team, and then I'll give you 5 minutes. There's 15 cards, so you should try and get through 3 cards per minute, essentially. All right? Go. Just to understand the experiments, the different experiments. At this point, it's just to understand the experiments. Thank you. Testing, testing. You got about a minute left. Right now, you're just understanding the experiments. You don't have to pick the ones, so you're not voting on them just yet. Okay, so hopefully you got through as many as you could as a facilitator. Maybe not, but we'll continue moving forward. All that means is as an individual on your team, you're going to have to read the card yourself, essentially, because you're going to go into voting now, okay? So remember I was saying how there's a trade-off. How quickly can we learn and get the answer to this question, essentially? So some of those experiments are really fast, and their quality of truth is actually quite high as well. So you're making trade-offs, okay? So as team members, what you're going to do is you're going to take 2 dots, and you're going to, again, vote on the experiment that you think will give you the data that you need and that you would like to run. You can put both dots on one experiment, or you can split them. So 1 dot on this experiment, 1 dot on this experiment. Totally up to you. But I'm going to give you 2 minutes. Vote for the experiments you think are the fastest to get the data towards answering your question, essentially.
And the decider does the
Afterwards, yeah, the decider. So I'll give you 2 minutes to do that. So you have about a minute left. $30 seconds. You guys are good? Remember, your experiment that you're voting for has to help you get the answer to that question, right? In some way in your mind. $10 seconds. Okay, hopefully you've voted. We're going to keep going. So decider, your time to break a tie or to go against your team if you want to be that person, essentially. 1 large dot, choose the experiment you think is the most appropriate to run. That's the fastest, that will get you the data that you need, essentially. So 1 minute for that.
red dot's supposed to go to the one which is the fastest.
Leah says we need one more with the crowd. Can we take it? She wants more crowd in the photo.
Okay. Yeah. All right, so hopefully everybody, the deciders made a decision, chosen one. If not, just pick the one that was the highest voted from your team's perspective. Okay, so now you're going to get a bit of time. So I'm going to give you a few more minutes. This is where I'm going to need my facilitators to keep track of time and make sure that you're moving through this part. So this is where you actually finalize your conversation around this experiment. So a couple things to consider. One, you already have your question because you voted on that, so you know what you're trying to learn. Two, you already have your experiment, the method in terms of how you're going to get the data because you voted on that, right? So these two should be pretty quick. But three, you want to start thinking about, okay, well, what does that execution look like? Like, how are we going to make this happen? And how are we going to measure this? So if we're doing like let's say we're doing an online ad and we're pitching the jacket, maybe it's on Facebook, for example, we can get in front of a lot of people rather quickly. But how are we going to make that decision, right? So the market is huge, 50 million people in North America alone. So if we get in front of 1,000 people for $40, essentially, how many of those 1,000 need to convert? So start just having a discussion around where's that line in the sand, okay? The reason that this discussion is so important is because when you run the experiment and then you get the results back, you need to make a decision as a team. And if you don't have this conversation before you run the experiment, what tends to happen is teams get confused. They're like, oh, it looks pretty good. You know, the data looks okay, but they never actually had that discussion around, well, what does green mean? What does yellow mean? What does red mean, right? So what will we do if less than 5% click on it? What will we do if more than 10% click on it? For now, don't worry about too much. Just figure out kind of like what would be the line in the sand for this experiment. Now, I know what you're thinking. Some of you might be thinking, well, some of these aren't experiments. They're just research, like talking to people, for example. So it's qualitative. Well, in that case, just think about, okay, well, how many people are you going to talk to? You're going to talk to 30 people, and how many people need to give you some positive direction, right? So out of 30 people, how many, what do we need to look for, essentially, okay? So I'm going to give you 6 minutes. Maybe you won't necessarily need all that time as a facilitator. Just think about, 2 minutes maybe per question. Well, the first two should be pretty quick. So just that third one in terms of how are we going to measure this? All right? So any questions? Will you just write on this? Yeah, you can just write on that with a Sharpie. The facilitator can write on it. And then decide who's going to present it afterwards, because I might do a pop quiz across tables and ask who wants to present their experiment. Okay?
This is about the only question we've selected, right?
The question you selected, the experiment that you want to run, and then how are you going to measure it? Like, what does that look like?
But if the team kind of like had like few different experiments,
Yeah.
and the decider chosen like another one.
Yeah, that's
So we'll
fine.
go with this
You're going with that one. Yeah. With whatever the decider. Yeah.
You're going with the blue dots.
You're going with the blue dots. Yeah.
Okay. So first try. Yeah, this question and this experiment. Why? So this is like it's make or break, right? If this thing doesn't work, like what? We'll just like ready?
Oh, you want to?
Oh yeah, I was maybe you're
back to our question, which was more a usability question. So if it hasn't been created at all,
Right.
then we're actually talking to the customer on how to create it to be used. So
Okay.
how do we test that?
Yeah. Well, because you want to learn this, right?
Yeah.
And you're saying like we think we can learn this by actually bringing them in and working with them, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just how far along do we have to be before we do that in order to run an experiment that is valuable?
Right. Right. So you have about a minute left. Okay, so you probably haven't finished designing your experiment. This stuff takes time, right? It's not going to happen, let's say, in 5 minutes, although that was a good effort. I hate to interrupt while you're actually working through that. Did anyone finish an experiment? Nobody? Close? Or you just don't want to share it? Anybody get close to writing down some metrics or some data? Close? Chris, you've got one? You guys have one? Anyone else have one? One in the back there. Jeff's got one. Leslie? Okay, so there's some people. Let's just ask some people to share, if you don't mind. Who wants to go first? Leslie?
Okay, so the question that we had, our learning question is, will people like the concept of wearing a jacket in the first place to deal with their back pain? So in terms of the method we chose, we went with using a pre-sale form to determine the interest of people purchasing a jacket to help with their back pain, and we would run this for 15 days. And so what we were looking at capturing for metrics and data to know if we were right or wrong was looking at if the number of sales increased. And for our fail or success metric, we didn't come to a number of what we wanted in terms of conversion, but we would be successful if when people came to our site, they were actually making a purchase. And in terms of next steps and what we would do with the data, would actually start making a prototype for these customers who purchased it through the pre-sale form.
Cool. Awesome. Pre-sale form's pretty cool because you can like find a chiropractor's office or physiotherapist. They get lots of people with back pain. And you can stand there and kind of do the offer, essentially, right? If they give you their personal information, maybe you're onto something. Very cool. Myron? Yes.
Here you go.
Sorry.
Thank you. So it's funny that you mentioned the chiropractor's office.
Oh, okay.
So the question that we asked was, how do we compete with chiropractors? And so what we decided to do was do a customer co-creation where we would target as our customer chiropractors. And so the design of our experiments is well, the duration is going to be 6 months because that's the general course of chiropractic intervention care.
Okay.
And we would basically actually we would partner with a chiropractor who would actually assess the types of clients that would be valid and reliable for this type of product. So if someone had a real big injury and they needed traction, we wouldn't just like randomly sign people up. We would use their expertise and give them a cut of the deal in some kind of way. But what we would do is we would actually have them take the initial assessment, people who are going to be doing chiropractic care at the beginning, and people who are going to be using our service, our device, et cetera. And over the course of the 6 months, at the end of that 6 months, we would actually be able to put them side by side and see which one was actually of the people who were healed with chiropractic care, what percentage of our users were equal, above, and below, and get a sense for what the efficacy is of our device compared to chiropractors, and then ultimately partner with chiropractors to sell this product inside of their office and build that market.
Right.
And perhaps we have other things we can do later on. I'm sorry.
No, you're right. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. But assuming that it actually works, like that there's...
Absolutely, yeah.
That makes sense. So don't scale it nationally across all chiropractors.
Right.
Okay, very cool. Anyone else have a different one?
So our question was, are there any other products out there that do the same thing? And we wanted to learn that. So we decided to use a landing page just to test that idea. And one of the metrics or one of the ways we would want to understand if there are any other brands out there or customers know about is ask on the landing page, name any number of brands you might know that do the same, that offer the same product. And our definition of failure was if on average or a high number of people named 3 or more brands, then we were either in a very competitive market and we may need to rethink certain things. And our measure for success, or an indicator of success to go ahead with the product, would be if they could come up with 1 or 2 or less number of product brands that did the same, created the same jacket. Then it's for us to pursue and see if there are any brands in people's minds. So that question didn't have meat, but we kind of put meat around it to sort of come up with that.
Cool, very cool. Thank you. One thing to consider, remember we were talking about speed and quality of truth, right? So here you didn't necessarily have enough time to kind of organize your ideas in terms of creative experiments, right? And then plot them, like how fast can we get it, how much truth. I gave you very little time, essentially, but it was very creative what you came up with. Like, hey, let's do a landing page and let's collect this data, let's say but you might find that maybe doing some quick data analysis might actually be faster, right? So you're always kind of thinking about what's the smallest, fastest thing I can do in order to get the highest level of truth, but that's very creative. Thank you. Another one? One more?
Sure. Hi. So our question was really around, would people even want this product, and if so, who? And so we actually chose kind of a combination of a few of these.
Okay, paired them.
So we thought ads would be a great way, and the ad would show that we have this great product, but we decided to A/B a little bit on the ads. And so we would run some with male models, some with female models, maybe some with people who were older or whatever, and we would have different numbers associated with that or different URLs, and we would try to understand who would be clicking, so we would, to get some idea of the market. The idea was that we would run this for a few months and then see the overall volume. Possibly, the page that they would go to ultimately would say, sorry, we're out of stock, we're back ordered, but give us your information and we'll let you know once we've made our next batch.
Yeah.
And so that way we capture their information. So that was the idea.
Good job, guys. All of you, really great. Nice. So, not a lot of time, but you came up with some really creative ways to get the data. So awesome. So high fives. Give each other high fives at your team. So we didn't really talk about this, but you noticed there was on the learning card there was a marker there, like 1 day, 10 days, 15 days, 30 days. A lot of times we call this learning velocity, right? How fast are we learning, essentially? And a lot of times we work with teams and say, okay, what can we learn in a day? Or what can we learn in a sprint? Or what can we learn this month, for example? Like in terms of those questions, riskiest assumptions, for example. But when we run the experiment, and then we get the data, essentially, we're making decisions. And so we do retrospectives, so we say, okay, what did we believe before that we no longer believe? So maybe we thought our customer was office workers, but in fact, our customers are chiropractors, for example. Maybe what new things did we learn that we didn't know before? And then ultimately, what's the decision that we're making? So you're running a retrospective based on the data, and you're making decisions, essentially. When you're making decisions, you might hear this word pivot. Well, a pivot just means that we're changing some element of that hypothesis, that strategy, right? So it's either the wrong customer, so we're going after a different customer or user, the wrong problem, different problem, or the wrong solution, different solution, essentially. So you're fundamentally changing some aspect of your strategy. You're probably not changing your vision. You still want to help people with back pain. So ultimately, your vision stays, but your implementation, your solution is changing, essentially. A persevere just means you got the answer to your assumption, and it was correct, so you're good. But now you have to take your next riskiest assumption, so your next critical question, and answer that until you don't have any further critical questions that can actually kill your idea, essentially. So you're almost kind of working through a question backlog, essentially, right? Validating your assumptions, getting the data, proving it, and then kind of moving on to the next critical aspect. So this is the de-risking element of it, essentially. And then finally, you might pull the plug. So you might learn something fundamental that says, hey, you know what? We should just stop this project or kill this product or kill this idea entirely. Almost kind of like the speedboat in British Columbia, but obviously doing that a lot faster than waiting 3 years and $300 million, right? It's hard because once we've already spent $50 million, what's spending another $50 million, right? Fall in love with your idea and you kind of move it forward, kind of ignoring the data, essentially. So you want to avoid that. You want to kind of create a bit of a rhythm, a learning cadence, and then use data to essentially make decisions off of that. So when do we run experiments? At the beginning of a complex initiative. Obviously, that's a key aspect to it. Maybe there's some uncertainty hitting your backlog, essentially, if you're working on a team. Maybe there's a really hairy problem that has kind of uncertain outcomes, essentially, and you've been tasked to solve it with a team. So that becomes quite critical in order to work essentially in this way. Some of us kind of have maybe seen this graph before, although it maybe might not coming out well here, but client requirements are unknown versus client requirements are pretty clear. Technology and infrastructure is unknown versus technology and infrastructure is pretty clear. If things are known, we love working in this world. We build out user stories, so here's my feature, this is what I want. As a user, I want this feature so that I get this benefit. But, well, what if we're not right? What if that's not the case? We believe that if we build this feature, that will provide this outcome or this benefit. So maybe instead we actually should write an experiment or at least have a conversation around, okay, well, this is just a belief. We're not quite sure. How do we actually test it, essentially? Right? Sometimes you hear spikes, which is kind of similar. So I need to learn about this. This is what I believe. Here's a major question that I have outstanding. So can we time box it, put some learning around that? And eventually, we'd like to bring it in and build out user stories, essentially. So I've just got a few more slides, and then we're going to do some Q&A. So I'm going to quickly go through these slides because I want to be cognizant of time, and I'm in between you and potentially some of you, Kelly's Landing, so I don't want that to happen. Experimentation helps us to explore opportunities, right? So explore different options, different ideas. Put data at the heart of your process, essentially. So help to align your stakeholders, help to align your team, because now you're making decisions based on evidence, based on data, and then spread that kind of culture throughout the rest of your organization. That book that I mentioned, so Escaping the Build Trap by Melissa Perry, she goes into depth, and she actually introduces this concept of a product kata, which is kind of really cool. So she kind of borrows from Toyota Kata, and she looks at, like, how do we as product people, essentially, look to work from the perspective of surfacing problems and challenges, right, that are linked ultimately to our goal, to our vision, essentially. So similar to the Toyota Kata, she says, okay, start with the direction. What's your goal? What are you trying to achieve? What are people doing today? So what's the current condition? What's the target? So what's the next first little goal that you'd like to achieve? And then what are some experiments that you can run? So very similar to what you guys just did right now. So if we took our example of Richard's magic jacket, our goal, our company goal, was that actionable metric that I was telling you about, right? So more than 80% of our user base will wear our product 3 or more times per week. We'd like to see that. That's the health of our product, essentially. If people are using our product and we're kind of hitting this target, then we know it's useful, essentially, and we can get some value. We can start building some business value. The customer's getting their customer value, essentially. So the next step is like, okay, well, what are people doing today? So we want to draw a quick journey, essentially, right? Capture the current state. So here's our customer. Ultimately, what's their goal, their objective? They want to reduce back pain, so that's the job to be done. Okay, so how do they interact with our product? How do they discover it? Maybe they go through online ads, for example, Google, Facebook. Maybe they come to a landing page or a marketing page with different people on it, for example. Some are males, some are females, for example. We're doing some A/B testing, potentially. Then they register and they request a trial offer. And then afterwards, we ship them a jacket that they can actually try for 30 days, essentially. Maybe they wear it for a month. And then we see, okay, is it actually improving their back pain? So are they actually getting the job to be done or the benefit that we're looking for, right? So maybe this is kind of what's happening in our current business, in our current model. So we're projecting a little bit, assuming that this is successful, let's say. So this is what's happening today. That's kind of our goal that we're looking for. There's a lot of different kind of interesting interactions throughout the journey. So on the marketing page, there's kind of their awareness and then their registration, right? So they're learning about it and then they're actually registering. Here, they're asking for it, and maybe there's actually, maybe an unboxing moment where they get the product and then they try it out. So the whole point about this is that there's different moments that potentially have an impact on our goal, right? On what we're actually trying to achieve. At any point in time, there could be challenges or problems associated, okay? So this is what they're currently doing right now. We have to find, okay, well, what's the first challenge? What's the first little goal? This is where things like data science, analytics teams, people on your team, for example, that can actually look into the data. How many people work with a team that have maybe an analytics person on the team? 1, 2, 3, 4. Raise your hands, 5, so I can clearly see them. Okay, so not a lot of people. But how many people have an analytics team or department that they can work with? Okay, a lot more people, for example. They can analyze some of this data for you, right? And they can say, okay, so you're trying to essentially increase your goal. So let's actually put it on, and let's track this for a second. So you got Richard's Magic Jacket as your product, office workers as your customers, back pain as the problem due to bad posture, and then your, what we're calling our North Star metric, right? So what's that one metric that we're kind of looking at from a product health perspective? And we're saying jackets worn. The more that they wear during the week, the more that we know that our product is working, and it's actually, they're getting benefit out of it. So jackets worn. But in order to increase that metric of jackets worn, we got to figure out, well, what's that first little challenge or that first little problem, essentially? And you might notice that, in fact, on that journey, a 2% increase in just helping people register for your product will actually give you like a 200% increase on jackets worn. Versus maybe when they're unboxing and they're trying the product for the first time, if you improve that moment, it only gives you a 150% increase on jackets worn, right? So it's kind of understanding where's the best bang for the buck if you make an improvement along that journey. But once you then understand that, so there's actually a greater opportunity here by fixing this challenge or this problem, now you start to run these experiments, right? So now you start talking to people, you start to kind of understand, and you want to somehow kind of keep track of them, right? So you can start to kind of see the needle moving, that outcome moving. So essentially, okay, today we're trying to improve the registration process, even though that's really upfront in the journey. Maybe there's a whole team just dedicated to the registration, to the marketing, for example. But we know that if we can improve that by 2%, that there's a 200% increase on jackets worn, which is our North Star metric, essentially. So all we know is that 50% of them are dropping off the form. So why are they dropping off? We have no clue. Let's go talk to them. So you can brainstorm with your team, brainstorm some different ideas, similar to what you guys did here with all the different experiments. Then run one, maybe get some data back and say, okay, so what do we expect? At least to get information about why they're dropping off. Maybe it's lack of trust. They don't actually believe that the product will do what it's meant to do. Okay, so now we can actually figure that and deal with that issue. So we can come up with some ideas. Maybe we actually have an idea of creating some testimonials on the landing page from doctors, for example, and then see kind of the impact there, essentially. So, but the whole point here is understanding, okay, what's the big picture? What are we trying to achieve? What's the problem at the moment? What's the smallest thing that we can do? And then kind of continue to measure and track that, working with teams and running experiments, essentially. Okay, so I know that was a lot of material right there, kind of at the end. In closing, experimentation ultimately is a process to really help teams make better decisions and move faster, essentially, so that they're reducing risk. Testing ideas, getting real data, putting that at the heart of your process, and also aligning teams on those decisions as well as your stakeholders. How are we doing for time? We got 10 minutes. Not bad. Maybe I went too fast on that last bit there. So let me turn it over to you. Thoughts, comments, questions?
Hi. Yeah, I just have a question about more operationalizing this. So when you actually see teams doing this, so do you see teams that are like innovation teams that are running this, and they're specifically running innovation, or are they development teams, or like a mix of the two, or what's the best practice in terms of structuring a team around doing this kind of experimentation?
Okay, great question. Actually, I was talking to somebody at the break just about this question as well. So obviously, innovation teams do a lot of this. And so very advanced innovation teams have governance processes all associated with this, right? So before we can scale this product or this idea, for example, we need to have proof or we need to have evidence. So they might have like a 90-day program. What do we learn in the first 30 days? Go back, get some additional funds. And we're actually saying like, yes, let's move this forward, for example. Let's do some feasibility testing. So innovation teams and new ventures and incubators, accelerators, they'll use this process quite heavily. Agile teams, it's good product management practice, essentially, right? So if they are launching a new initiative, for example, and there's a lot of uncertainty, they might run a design sprint, which a design sprint just simply takes a lot of what we talked about today and it kind of compresses it in that 5 days. So let's build a clickable prototype, let's bring in some customers, let's get some data, essentially. They might not run that all the time, so they're just running it at certain points, of that uncertainty with respect to the product. They may have the infrastructure and the analytics people already on their team to be able to do some of that more advanced stuff, essentially. Okay, where are there problems in the interactions? What problem can we work on to really improve the experience of the product that will give us the best bang for the buck on that value proposition or that job to be done, essentially?
Hi. Question, can you run the same kind of thing for existing products? So not for new things that haven't been built yet, and what would the differences be?
Good question. So for an existing product, obviously one thing that's helpful is to make sure you have the discipline, but also the infrastructure to collect the data. So sometimes you might not necessarily have the analytics or the capabilities in the existing product, so you'd have to kind of retrofit the product to have some of that. Things like link tracking, reporting, bringing that information to capture interactions. But ultimately, if you're making any kind of incremental innovation or improvement to the product, there's an opportunity to experiment there, essentially. Whether that's just through some generative research, so talking to people, for example, bringing them in, co-creating. Yeah, you can definitely do it on existing products, for sure. Good question.
I have a question about the best way to figure out a good sample size. So if you're running A/B tests, if you're running a concierge test, for each product, each thing, it's different what sample size you need to make it a good test. So how do you go about figuring out what is a good sample size?
Yeah, for sure. That could be a career maker or breaker. Absolutely. So we were talking about jackets, and we were talking about healthcare and the market opportunity, for example. So sometimes we say things like, okay, let's say validate qualitatively, right? So a lot of usability tests are great. We bring people in, we show them our product. We only need 5 or 6 people to see the patterns, assuming they fit our persona. And that's good enough data to actually work on that. But then, kind of again, what people say, but then how they react or behave in market can be different. So we verify quantitatively, essentially, and say, okay, so we're going to run a test, but we need a good sample size to get the true measure of success here. So if 50 million people, that's a huge market. Even if we get 1% of that market, that's massive, let's say. That's a good business for now to start with and to sustain. So there's always a margin of error in your experimentation, right? If you've got a plus or minus 5% margin of error, and you're looking for a 1% fulfillment, essentially, then that could make or break your idea, right? So there's a lot of online tools that you can kind of use to say, okay, well, what's your population? and it'll come back and kind of give you a measurement. So what's your margin of error that you're looking for? And it'll say, okay, you're going to have to test with at least 400 or 500 people, essentially. So when you're putting in the Facebook ad or the LinkedIn ad, you want to make sure that you're getting enough people that fit that hypothesis of this is my customer in order to be able to get the quality of data that you need, knowing that you're going to be making a good business decision from there. So definitely statistics, and there's a lot of guys that are really good at this topic of experimentation and statistics. If you're interested in that, Tristan Cromer, Peter's actually really good at it. You can definitely talk to him about it. Yeah, but it's a great question for sure.
Hi. Right, I have a question actually for the entire audience. Who here thinks that the value proposition of this product, like having a better posture in front of your computer, is worth paying for? And who will use or who will pay for it? Can you raise your hand?
I pay $1.
Okay. Right. Okay, so who has back pain? And those who have back pain still will not pay for the benefit of having better posture. That's interesting, right there, right?
It doesn't
take corrective action, though.
Right, so who had back pain and who will not want the product? Okay, now the last question.
Maybe not the implementation, so the jacket probably
Exactly.
not. Yeah,
So who will buy the benefit if it was not depending on a jacket? So if you will get the benefit, but not having to buy a jacket. Okay, this is what I wanted to know. Yeah, thank you.
There's a great book. The mom's test.
I have a way to do it without a jacket. I have a way to do it without the jacket.
Yeah. So. Nobody's wearing a jacket. No. Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
one thing to quickly think about is technically that question is slightly flawed, right? So I wouldn't be building a business based on the data that you get from that question. And the only reason is because as humans, we're terrible at predicting future behavior, right? So I might say, oh, yes, I will use the jacket, but then not use the jacket, essentially. We're better at telling like past experience, past stories, evidence based on historical data, essentially. There's a great book if you want to learn more about like questions and talking to humans, talking to people, and what brings good data versus bad data. It's called The Mom's Test. Yeah. Very small book, a great book. And then testing with humans is another good one as well. It's testing with humans, right? Yeah. There was one more question.
Yeah,
here?
I have a question. Firstly, just a comment. I think the question that you decide to validate is very important, but then the method to answer that specific question is very important. So that was something we learned as a group from this exercise, is we had to pick the right question that we wanted to answer, and then the method was something that we challenged ourselves with, and part of it worked out, part of it didn't. So just a little feedback. It was really good. The question I have is, what's your thought on running multiple experiments at the same time of different kinds? And you could, but should innovation or product teams focus on one or a small percentage or number of experiments versus run a multiple bunch to collect all that data together and then see where they land?
If you have the discipline, the capacity, and let's say the practice or the experience of either doing multi kind of variable testing or multi-experiment testing, then absolutely, like definitely reap that benefit. There's also a good article online for doing exactly that, where you can pair up tests to get even better data, let's say. So similar to what Jeff, I think, was doing earlier when he was saying, hey, we're going to run a couple with like link tracking and online ads. Actually, the book that David Bland is coming out with is all about exactly that. So doing some more advanced experimentation, pairing up experiments, essentially. But yeah, you could do that. For sure.
Thanks.
Well, hopefully you got some value out of this. Thank you so much for allowing me to spend the time with you. I appreciate that. And enjoy your evening.
Hey, folks. If you wouldn't mind, help us tidy up by taking any cans or bottles, so forth, to the recycle bins. Tidy up your tables, gather the pens together. We'll come around and collect them. And if you're interested, there'll be a bunch of people going to Kelly's Landing afterwards for an after party. Thanks so much for coming out.